Hey guys, thanks for joining us today. We believe that God's Word has the power to change lives. So grab a pen and paper and get ready for this message.
Amen, amen. So we are going to continue our series. We kicked this off last week. We were looking at the life of Joseph. And in this series, we are looking at Bible stories where people were kind of dealt a bad hand, where they had some type of a wound or something that was inflicted on them, but yet they were able to, by following God's commands and honoring God and the relationships, that God was able to benefit them. We talked about last week with Joseph. He was sold into slavery, but even though man tried to kill the dream that God had placed in his heart, it was impossible. God was able to restore that. And we talked about how God even used Joseph later to provide, to protect, to take care of those who had hurt him the most. And that's really what we want to look at in this thing, is that we're going to look at different types of wounds, but realize that your wound doesn't have to define who you are. Your wound doesn't have to throw you off God's plan for your life. And so last week we looked at a family wound. This week we're going to look at an authority wound. And really with David, it's even more than an authority wound. David had family wounds. He had all kinds of different wounds. But before we do, I want to remind you of the scripture that we're pulling this from. This is from Romans chapter 12, where Paul is writing about how we're supposed to deal with our enemies. Romans chapter 12, verse 18, it says, "If possible, so far as it depends upon you, be at peace with all men." And last week we pointed out this thing because it's very important. It says, as long as as far as it depends upon you. A lot of times we want to blame other people for the condition of our relationships, where Paul is putting the responsibility in your lap. He's putting it in your court. You can't control what other people do, but you can control how you respond to what other people do in your life. And here it says that no matter what anybody has done to you, that you can continue to pursue peace. And so we're going to look at the life of David. David's life, the story that kind of picks up in 1 Samuel chapter 16. But before, I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of background before we look at chapter 16. Samuel was a prophet in the nation of Israel. And Samuel, for a long time, had acted as a judge, which is really kind of a leader of the group of people. So this would be like Samuel is not only just a prophet from God, but he has an important part in like government, and be kind of like a governor or something of an area. And so this is a very important man, and he had been helping lead the children of Israel, but they wanted a king, and they were begging for a king because they wanted to be like every other nation. And so God told him, he said, okay, anoint a king. You can anoint Saul to be their king. And then Saul began to do things his own way. There was a few things that God gave him specific instructions, and Saul wouldn't obey those instructions. And so God removed his spirit and told Samuel, I want you to go to the house of Jesse, and I want you to anoint a new king. And that's where the story picks up in 1 Samuel chapter 16. And David's family, David had a bunch of older brothers, and David was the youngest in his family. And so in that day, you got to remember, it's kind of a patriarchal society. The patriarch of the family, then the older brother, and kind of down, and the lowest brother was kind of the least of the least within the home. And that's really what happened here. Samuel is coming to the house of Jesse. Jesse invites all of the other brothers to come to this event, and Jesse begins to pass the brothers from oldest to the youngest in front of Samuel. And Samuel looks at Eliab, and he sees Eliab's this tall guy, handsome, rugged looking guy, and so he thinks that he's automatically that's going to be the guy, that's going to be the king. But he doesn't select him. He said, no, God tells him, you're looking at the outward appearance. I look on the heart. And all of the brothers passed by, and Samuel said, none of these are the king. Do you have any other children? And so Samuel said, well, yeah, the youngest is out watching the sheep, but I mean, he's just a shepherd. And Samuel says, I'm not going anywhere until I meet him. And then you know the story where David comes and God anoints him to be the king. And in our mind, the minute that you're anointed, that means you're going straight to the palace or you're going to begin to walk in whatever it was. But instead, David didn't go straight to the palace. David went back to watching sheep. And then later in chapter 16, Saul is tormented by an evil spirit, and somebody suggests to him, well, why don't you find somebody to play the harp? Maybe that will kind of soothe you, calm you down a little bit and everything. And they heard of David, because while David was watching his sheep, he was playing his harp. He was a musician. And so David comes and plays for Saul, and it just kind of brings peace to him. And so Saul's continually sending for David. It says that he found favor so much with David that he made David his armor bearer. Now, an armor bearer isn't a position that we're familiar with a lot today because we don't go into battle with armor on today. We don't go in with a shield and a sword and helmet and this type of thing, fighting like these different battles like they did during this time. And in the time, an armor bearer was a very important person. An armor bearer was somebody that you literally trusted your life with because your armor only covered the front part of you. And your back, you needed somebody who was going to watch your back. And so an armor bearer, when you would go into battle, they would be watching the king's back or a general or something like that. They would help support them. They would help carry their armor into battle and everything. They were there to serve somebody in a higher position of authority like a king. And so this is a very high position. This means that Saul not only trusts David to be his musician, but Saul trusts David with his life because he's literally allowing him to fight the battle with him. And so if you fast forward into chapter 17, you see where David is kind of going back and forth. He's watching the sheep. He's going to the palace. He's watching the sheep. He's going to the palace and kind of back and forth. And then at one point in chapter 17, this big giant shows up named Goliath. And Goliath is standing across the valley and he's taunting the Lord's armies and everybody is too afraid to go fight. Even King Saul, who's supposed to be the leader of this, is too afraid to go into battle. And after about 40 days of this, Jesse had told David to go deliver lunch to his brothers. Now I want you to think about this, just the humility and character that it took for David, because David was anointed to be king. And David's brothers and his dad and everybody didn't even think enough about him to invite him to the thing when Samuel was going to be visiting. But yet he continued to just faithfully honor his father and serve even his brothers. And so he goes to deliver food there. And as he's delivering the food, his older brother sees him there and begins to say, oh, you just came down here to see a fight. And he begins to kind of attack David and question his heart and everything about why he's there. And so finally, David just kind of pushes past all of the things that his brother is coming out and attacking him with and everything. And he just tells Saul, he's like, look, you don't need to be afraid. I'll go fight this giant. I will go in. I'll take care of this. God has delivered me before. I fought a bear. I fought a lion. God protected me. This giant's going down the same way that they did. And so Saul agrees to let David go into the battle, and he goes into the battle, and you know, we know the story. He goes in with just a little slingshot, and the giant is yelling things at him and telling him he's going to feed his bones, his body to the birds, and David doesn't back down one bit. He's like, oh no, I'm going to feed your flesh to the birds. You come to me with the spear and the sword, I come to you in the name of the Lord. You're going down, sucker. I mean, that's kind of the Brandon International version, but that's what he does, and you know, he hits the first rock, hits Goliath, knocks him out. He goes over, he cuts his head off. All the Israelites rush into battle, and they win this great this great honor and great battle and everything. And so Saul had said, whoever defeats the giant, that he was going to give his firstborn daughter to. And so there's all these different promises and stuff. And so there's something that happened here that when I read through this over a couple weeks ago, I noticed something that Saul, you remember, David had been playing the harp for him. David had been his armor bearer, this trusted position. David even talked to him before the battle. He's going to go fight Goliath. But after the battle is over, Saul has no clue who David is this entire time. Now, some of us, if somebody forgets our name or forgets our birthday or forgets something like that, like we're mad at him, we're not talking to him again. Here is a guy that David has served faithfully, that David has protected in battle, that David has carried his armor, has done all of these things. And Saul is such a bad leader that, like, he doesn't even know that person's name. Now, after I read that, I did not feel nearly as bad about my issue with remembering names and stuff, because, like, I remember Travis because he comes and plays music for me every single week and all of that. And, you know, I can remember him because he serves the people who are kind of closer and I'm in with 90% of the time, unless they're one of my kids, you know, because I always get my kids' names wrong. But I'll remember who they are. But Saul didn't even remember David. In chapter 17, verse 55, you see this. It says, when Saul saw David was going out against the Philistines, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this young man? And Abner said, by your life, O king, I do not know. And it goes on and says, so when David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, and the Philistine's head in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And David said, I'm the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. Now, some of us, if somebody that we had served and been faithful to for that period of time came up and said, what's your name again? We'd be like, hold on, you don't know who I am? I did this, and we're going to start listing everything that we ever did. We're going to be offended, and we're going to be like, you know what? I'm going to go to some other church where they remember my name. I mean, that's the way a lot of people would do. But David was just like, he didn't even say, were you kidding me? You don't even know who I am? He said, I'm the son of your servant Jesse. He just continued to honor, just continued to speak up to him. It goes on. And at this point in chapter 18, Saul sees the value of David. He decides he's going to keep him around and go into battle with him. You know, he won this great battles, and then in the beginning of 18, they're going into different battles, and they're just winning. There's just this success everywhere that David goes with Saul. There's victory and everything is going great. I mean, in David's mind, you know, if he would have thought anything had gotten off track by him having to go back to the sheep, he's thinking, I'm going to come to the palace now. You know, I'm back in with King Saul. I'm eating at the king's table. Everything's good. I'm going to become king. This is going to be the path. Saul is going to mentor me, train me, and then I'm going to become the king of Israel. And everything looked like it was kind of going that direction, until some ladies in the town, when they were coming back from a victory, began to sing, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. And it says from that point on, Saul became jealous, and Saul's heart turned against David. even to the point of where in chapter 18 and chapter 19, he's throwing spears at David, trying to pin them up against the wall. You remember, David was supposed to receive Saul's wife, or Saul's daughter, as his wife because he beat Goliath. But in I think it's in chapter 18, he gives his daughter to another man to be married. I told the first service this: if Mr. Tommy would have tried to pull that switch, and instead of giving me Melody to be my wife, tried to bring out Katie and tell me that that was going to be my wife, I'll tell you what, I would not be a happy man. I would not. I mean, father-in-law right there, he's on my bad side if that's the case. I mean, this whole thing, Saul continually is trying to hurt David and doing things to hurt David. Even to the point of, after he had already defeated Goliath, he gives the daughter away. He's got another daughter that sees David and thinks he's kind of good looking and everything, named Michael. And he said, well, okay, well, you can marry her. But you can do it for the low, low price of 100 Philistine foreskins. Now, for those of you younger kids that didn't take the advantage of children's ministry, you can ask your parents what a foreskin is later. But here's what you need to know about a foreskin is no man is willingly offering up their foreskin, especially an enemy. They're not just going to be like, hey, Dave, you can come take mine. I want to contribute to your wedding fund. It ain't happening. And what he's doing, I mean, the only way to get 100 foreskins is to kill 100 men, because there's no donor program going on. Just saying. Saul is setting him up to be killed. If he wasn't able to pin him to the wall himself with the spear, he's going to set him up to the place where one of these 100 Philistines is going to be able to kill him. And so David goes above and beyond. He doesn't just bring back 100, he brings back 200. He could have been like, hold on, wait, I've already killed the giant. What are you talking about? He could have done all of those things, but David just did. He continued to serve. Continued to honor King Saul, no matter what. It goes on, and Saul begins to chase him, and even takes 3,000 people to chase after him. And one of the places that David's running for his life, he stops in a city called Nob, and there was a priest there, and he asked the priest for some help, and the priest gave him some bread and gave him Goliath's sword, which David had won. And everything, and Saul finds out about that, and Saul goes in there and kills all the priests, all their kids, and all their wives. I mean, Saul has gone crazy. Now, I don't know about you, but I've had some negative authorities. I've had some bad authorities in my life. I've never had them try to kill me. I've never had to have them try to get me killed. I've never had them try to steal my wife. None of those things. No matter how negative authority I've had in my life, I've never had those situations. Or kill an entire village of priests because somebody helped me. And that's where we're going to pick up the story. And we're going to give you 4 things that David did to wage peace with Saul. The first thing is this, is he continued to honor Saul. Now, I want you to realize something. When Saul started throwing spears and Saul started being physically abusive and everything, David knew it was time to get out of there. He wasn't just sharpening the spear and handing it back to him and giving him advice on how to throw the spear better. He ran for his life. Here's the thing, you don't have to be like physically there to continue to honor somebody. And David, as he's running from his life, as they're trying to kill him and chasing him down, we're going to pick up the story in 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 2. It says, Saul took 3,000 chosen men. Listen, he didn't just round up any 3,000 volunteers. He took the best of the best, special forces recon, to go find David. That's how bad he hated him. He took 3,000 men, and they went to seat David and his men in front of the rock of the wild goats. And it came to the sheepfold on the way, and there was a cave. And Saul went into the cave to relieve himself. In other words, Saul went to go potty. He goes into the cave to go potty, and little does he know, but David and his men are in the back of the cave, in the inner recesses of the cave. And it says, the men of David said to him, behold, this is the day that the Lord said to you, behold, I'm going to give your enemy into your hands, and you shall do with him as it seems good to you. Then David arose, and he cut off the edge of Saul's robe secretly. Now, as David goes up and he's got his sword in his hand, I'm sure that Abishai and all those warrior guys that are with him, they're like, oh yeah, he's going to cut his head off. He's going to kill him. And David goes up and just cuts the edge of his robe and walks back. And they're like, David, you missed. Cut his neck. You're not going to kill him by cutting his clothes off. I mean, they're like, they cannot believe. They think, here it is. This is your opportunity to get even. This is the man who's got an army out there trying to kill you. And God made him have to go number 2 to bring him in here so that you could sneak up behind him and take his life. And you cut his robe? It shocked his military that David would still honor a king that was trying to kill him. But see, what he did is he set an example for the way that he could be followed and that he expected to be followed. A lot of times we don't realize our lack of honoring authority is actually hindering us and the people who are following us. Our disrespect to authority is causing our children to disrespect us because we're showing them that it's okay. We're teaching them rebellion versus teaching them to honor authority. David was teaching his men, you don't touch the king because God has anointed the king to be there. But verse 5, it says it came about afterwards that David's conscience bothered him and because he had cut the edge of Saul's robe. So even the fact that he had cut the robe, because the robe was the symbol of honor. It was the symbol of the throne. It was the representation that put Saul above the other people was that robe. And when he cut that was an attack against the crown and against the position. Verse 6, it says, so he said to his men, far be it from me, because of the Lord, that I should have done this, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed. He's teaching them, I was completely wrong. Listen, I think some of us need to go back and begin to use some moments as some teaching moments. To go back to our kids and say, hey, kids, you know when you saw me yelling at that referee like that? I was completely wrong in dishonoring the authority that he had in that position in that moment. When you heard me talking about my boss like that and you heard me saying all those negative things, I was completely wrong by doing that. What's he doing? He's doing the second thing that was necessary to wage peace. He was repenting from any offense that he had caused. Listen, in this thing, David is 99.9% innocent. He hasn't done anything to King Saul. Everything King Saul asked him to do, play the harp, go to battle, kill men for their foreskins, whatever it was, David did any of it. The one thing that he did that was wrong was cut the robe and disrespect him. And see, here's the thing. Saul didn't even know that David had done that. Chances are when David realizes that the robe's cut, he probably thinks he got it caught on a rock or caught on something and just ripped it and doesn't even think anything about it. But David couldn't just let it go because he knew he had sinned against the anointed. In verse 8, it says, now afterward David arose and he went out of the cave and called after Saul. Now I want you to think about this for a minute. If you are running from a madman who has just massacred an entire group of priests, who has shown that he's not afraid to kill anybody, and you are running from your life, you've been running not just for a week or two, but for years, it is not a good thing that when the king doesn't notice that you're there and he's looking for you and he's got the military, it's not a good thing to jump out of the thing and be like, "Hey, Saul, I'm over here." But that's exactly what David did. But look at the way he talked to him. It says he came out and he called after Saul and he said, "My Lord, the king." He showed honor to the position and authority that Saul had. And it says when Saul looked behind him, David bowed his face to the ground. So look, he goes down into a position just like this. It says not only did he bow, but he went completely prostrate before him. Again, this is a man who has 3,000 soldiers that have been hunting you down for years. This is a man who has tried to kill you himself, has tried to have you killed by others, who has killed people who has helped you. And you're laying yourself completely out in a position like that. You talk about vulnerable. Some people think, well, I can't work for that guy. I'm going to end up, the company's going to go under if I continue to honor him or whatever. David is laying his life in a crazy man's hand. He's risking it all. And Saul knows that. And Saul is so moved by this that Saul looks at David and he's like, "Look, you're a better man than I am. I am sorry. I shouldn't have been coming after you this way." And it says that Saul went away and left him. And that would have been great if the story would have ended right there. But the story didn't end right there. Saul came back with his army again. And that's when David had to do the third thing. He had to refuse to defend himself. David comes upon Saul's army and at night, and they're all asleep in a little circle. Saul's in the middle. The men are circled around the outside. In 1 Samuel 26, verse 7, it says, "So David and Abishai came to the people by night, and behold, Saul was laying in the inside circle of the camp with a spear stuck in the ground by his head. And Abner, who was the commander of the army, and the people were laying around him. And Abishai said to David, 'Today God has delivered your enemy into your hand. Now therefore, please let me strike him with the spear to the ground with one stroke, and I will not strike him a second time.'" So Abishai, David before said, "Far be it from me to touch the Lord's anointed. I can't touch the Lord's anointed." So Abishai says, "Look, if you can't do it, can I? Because I don't have a problem. And look, all it will take is one blow. I'll pin him to the ground. Peace, we're out. We're gone. This is all over. You take the throne. Everything works out fine. Let me do it for you. I understand that God might get mad at you if you do it. But why don't you just let me do it?" And David refused to even allow Abishai to take offense. I don't know about you, but there's sometimes when I haven't defended myself, but I sure haven't stopped somebody else from going and defending me. And David refused. In verse 9 it says, "But David said to Abishai, 'Do not destroy him. For who can stretch out their hand against the Lord's anointed and be without guilt?'" So David broadens the horizon here and said, this isn't just about a me and God thing. This is about anybody. When you attack who God has anointed. And I know one of the first things that people are thinking is, well, God hasn't anointed my leader. He's a jerk. He's an idiot. He's not even a godly man. I don't think that Saul was acting very godly, for one. But for two, Romans 13 is clear that every person who is in a position of authority has been put in that position of authority by God. David understood that two wrongs aren't going to make a right. By him doing wrong and me retaliating, the situation isn't going to be right in God's eyes. And he completely refused to retaliate because he did the fourth thing. He trusted God to be his defense. I said earlier that David, when he bowed down, he was laying his hands into the hand of a crazy man. Not in David's mind. When David was bowing down, he knew that he had came against the Lord's anointed. And so he was placing himself in God's hand for judgment. And God protected him. Verse 10, it says that David said also, as the Lord lives, surely the Lord will strike him. Or his day will come when he dies. Or he will go down to battle and he will perish. But the Lord forbid that I should stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed. But please now take the spear that is at his head and the jug of water and let us go. David said, look, God's the one who anointed me. God's the one who would get me to the kingdom. I don't have to take these things into my own hand. And when I get to the throne, I want to know that I didn't do anything to make my way to get there. That I was there because God placed me there. I want to have set an example of the type of loyalty and type of commitment that you should have. You know, when we were in Louisiana, there was different periods of times, because I'm telling you, every church has periods of times where people start getting mad and they start gossiping, they start spreading stuff, and all these different things start going on because the enemy knows the power that we have when there's unity and all that. And he's afraid of unity. So he tries to slow some people in there to try to sow some discord, to try to cause some, to ruffle some feathers and different things, to try to cause some division and everything. And you know, when we were in Louisiana, it was the same type of thing. We're serving under Pastor Mark, and there's different things that are happening, different opportunities to be offended, different opportunities to be wounded, and all of this. And there was one particular time where a lot of people had left the church. A lot of leaders, a lot of people that, you know, we were close to. And I remember Melody was just like, do we need to pray about what we're supposed to do? And I told her, I said, no, we don't need to. Because we're going to serve Pastor Mark the way that we would want to be served when we're senior pastors one day. He hadn't done anything. There's no sin. There's no nothing like that. There's no reason other than people just didn't like something that he said. We're not doing that. We're staying faithful. We're serving him the way we would want to be served one day. And we stayed. And thank God we stayed. Because a lot of the people went over to another church, and that other church had different issues and all these things, heartaches and pains and different things that happened in that church. And because we stayed where we were, we didn't have any of that. Because we stayed where we were able to be invested in by Pastor Mark and Cindy. God did so many things in mine and Melody's marriage to prepare us to be able to come and be senior pastors one day. We didn't take anything into our hands. Even the thing of leaving to start a church. That wasn't something that I went to Pastor Mark and said, hey, it's time for me to go start the church. I went and talked to him about some things, and he said, hey, it's time for you to go start the church, and we're going to be behind you, we're going to support you, and we're going to send you. And we still have that close relationship where we talk to each other just about every week and pray for one another. There's relationships that's formed just by trusting God that you don't have to make things happen in yourself. David fully surrendered. And he said, one day, King Saul is going to go into a battle. He's going to die. Something's going to happen to him. God's going to take care of this. And that's exactly what happened. But when it happened and Saul died in battle, David mourned. David was broken. Even to the place where this one messenger knew that David was going to end up being the next king and everything. So he's trying to get promoted by going and telling David that he was the one that killed Saul. And so he tells this story. He says, hey, King Saul is dead. And he said, well, what happened? He said, well, I saw him laying on the side of the road, and he'd been badly wounded. He was about to die, and he was begging me to just go ahead and strike him and kill him so that he wouldn't have to sit there and suffer. And so I did. And David looked at him and said, who are you to stretch out your hand against the Lord's anointed? And he had him executed. Because he was willing to take the king's life. And David mourned and he wept. How can you mourn and weep over somebody who took your wife and gave her to somebody else, who tried to have you killed, who chased you down for years with an army, who killed your friend and all of the other priests in an entire city? How in the world can you do that? And it comes down to one thing. David wanted to please God in the areas of his relationship. David wanted to please God with his heart. David knew who he was in his relationship with God. He knew that if he was anointed to be king, that it would be God that would get him there. And he didn't have to promote himself. He didn't have to find validation in anybody else. He didn't have to put undue responsibility. Sometimes we try to, we are so dependent on other people for our identity because of different wounds that have happened. And we're so insecure that if people don't recognize something that we do, that we get offended because we weren't recognized, or they don't honor the way that we think they should, or they forget something important to us or whatever, then we begin to have hard feelings and bitterness and anger and all this because we are trying to find our identity in man. And man will always fail you. I'm just telling you right now, if you try to find your place with God through me, I am going to fail you because I'm just a human. And it would be very easy to get offended. But if you know who you are in God, and you know who you are in Christ, then you don't look to people to feel something that only God can. And that keeps down the wounds. That's how you're able to pursue peace, no matter what happens. You can't control what other people do, but you can control how you respond to what other people do. Are you going to pursue peace like David did? Or are you going to demand an apology and demand an explanation or demand to be right? And really, that's the difference in is, do you want to honor God with all your relationships, or do you insist on the apology? As far as it lies within you, you are called to pursue peace.
Again, thanks so much for tuning in today. We hope that you've enjoyed this message and that you felt the presence of God right where you are. If you did enjoy it, we'd love to see you live at one of our campuses. Mount Hope meets at 9, 11, and 5, and Summersville meets at 11. We'll see you there.